Thank you very much for having me. I especially want to thank Erik for his communication with me over the last year and for meeting with me shortly beforehand to discuss this. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here to present on one of the chapters of my PhD. This talk is called Does a Self Pattern Remain in People with Dementia? And spoiler alert, I'm going to be arguing, yes, that it can remain. So you'll notice here I say, I'm going to be talking about selfhood. I know that some people distinguish selfhood and personhood. I'm going to be using those interchangeably, with the thought being that if I do argue that a self pattern remains in people with dementia, then that's going to allow that personhood does remain anyway, even if you have a slightly different conception of personhood than you do selfhood. So I will just start by saying a little bit about myself and the project that I'm doing in my PhD. So as Erik said, I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of York, and I work in philosophy. I've got a very philosophical background. I did my undergrad and my master's in philosophy as well. And my project, my PhD, hopes to elucidate first-person experiences of dementia, drawing on methods in the phenomenological tradition in order to gain a better understanding of their experiences. So what I do is generally I look at as many first-person testimonies as I can get hold of from people with dementia themselves, whether this be autobiographies, memoirs, clinical studies where they've been interviewed, and then I apply phenomenology in order to provide a better understanding. So when I do this, my thesis is divided into a few different themes. And for me, I knew from the beginning that I wanted one of my themes to be on the topic of selfhood, because it is such a big thing in dementia as to like whether or not they lose their selfhood. It's sort of like a big stereotype that they do. So this talk is divided into 3 sections. So I'm going to begin by talking about the influence of stigma and stereotypes on the supposed image of dementia as someone who has lost their selfhood or as a non-person, and the effect this might have on experiences of ambiguous loss, particularly in caregivers and family members. Then I am going to talk about Sean Gallagher's pattern theory of self and how this might apply to people with dementia. Then finally, and I hope this will be the sort of big point that convinces everyone that a pattern self does remain in people with dementia, and that is I'm going to look to the phenomenon of paradoxical lucidity as a case study for how a pattern self might persist in people with dementia. So to begin, I will just say a little bit about this supposed image of dementia, this stereotypical view of people with dementia that has been sort of the tradition across the years. So I guess it's fair to me to say unkind, but unkind language has been used to talk about people with dementia in the past. So it's been described as a slow unraveling of self, or an unbecoming of self, or an inexorable dissolution of the self, and even a drifting towards the threshold of unbeing. Similarly, and more recently, they've been referred to as empty shells, even vegetables. The disease has even been referred to as a zombification. And a recent, well, I say recent, not that recent, 2008, an article in The Guardian about what it's like to have dementia referred to it as being trapped in the living death of dementia, which for many is the most fearful of all endings. Relatives of sufferers often describe it as the illness that slowly switches off the lights in the brain. Savagely and pitilessly, it strips away memory, language, and personality, leaving only the shell of its victims behind. Finally, it robs them of their lives. So the language here used is quite brutal, and it's not exactly going to instill confidence in someone who's just been diagnosed with dementia, especially when kind of looking forward to their future. It's also going to have a negative effect on stigma. And for instance, Young and colleagues found that stigma is often exacerbated by the kind of language used to talk about dementia and about the person's diagnosed with it. So Milne asserts that the use of negative language is the face of public stigma. But as Crichton, Carroll, and Kidd point out, it's kind of unfounded that this language is being used, because the stereotype is the belief that the impairment of cognitive function is severe and global, that the person has or will rapidly and inevitably become a vegetable. In fact, this is hardly ever the case, except perhaps in the final stages of the illness. So there is this assumption when you hear the word dementia that they just are all vegetables, are all empty shells. But the image that they have, that they're basing this language on, is often an image that's at the very, very end stage of dementia. And there are often many, many years in the run up to that stage. Christian, Carroll, and Kidd also point out that such language is likely to evoke more instances of epistemic injustice, general mistreatment of people with dementia, or just a general lack of respect for them as human beings with agency. Now, I'd like to talk about the impact of this, the stigma and the language used around dementia on people diagnosed. So I mentioned before that it didn't exactly seem to instill confidence in people who've been diagnosed when we are using language like this. Well, as part of my research, I look at a lot of autobiographies, and some of these quotes, it might even be all of them. I'm just going to move this little thing so I can see. Yeah, all of these quotes are from autobiographies that I've read from people with dementia themselves, talking about their lived experiences of having dementia. So Christine Bryden at the top here. Well, this is in her autobiography. She has these segments where she talks about different people with dementia's experiences as well as her own. And this particular quote is about someone called Hannah who has dementia. And for Hannah, she, on diagnosis, thought, well, when would her daughter and husband have to face up to her departure? Would she really disintegrate as a human being and be unable to know them? Similarly, you've got this autobiography by Rose, that's someone else who has dementia again, who says, how long did I have to live with some sense of what was going on around me? How long would it be before I became a vegetable? Mobley says, the stigma of the disease is to put you in a bed having to be turned every 3 hours by on-duty nurses, or sitting in a chair waiting to be fed and to wipe drools from your mouth, having to be carried away from the bed to the chair because you can't walk anymore. And Helga Rohrer says, let's be honest, what image do we have of people with dementia? People with dementia are old, in need of care, helpless and dependent. They can't look after themselves or their children, and certainly can't live unsupervised in their own home. They need care, if possible, round the clock, because they are always running away, getting lost, are inappropriately dressed, and have simply lost it. So we can see with these quotes so far that it is a huge worry that they are going to lose it. They are going to become a vegetable, and they are very aware of the stigma and the stereotypes that actually exist out there, and that very much affects the way that they look towards their future, no longer with one where they hope for positive things in their future, but instead of one where they become this image that they have. Similarly, at the bottom, you've got another quote from Bryden. Her fears of becoming this non-person are so pronounced that she jokes that maybe this unusual spot that she had on her leg, she says, maybe it's cancer, and if I do not get it treated, I could die as me, not some very altered person who is totally confused and not connecting with life around her. So the fears there are so pronounced that she's actually wishing that she had cancer instead. And that's very similar to another book that I read. I think that might have been Davis's autobiography, where when they were diagnosed with dementia, their doctor actually told them that they wished that it was cancer instead, because cancer is a lot more treatable than dementia, which just really brings home this fear of becoming what this image is of dementia, that they would rather have cancer. Similarly, the impact of the language on caregivers, family members, loved ones. I've only picked out a couple of quotes here, but there were several studies that I looked at where caregivers and family members were interviewed about what it was like to have a loved one with dementia. So in Dupuy's study, they say about their mum has not reached the stage where there is nothing there, where she's a vegetable. She can still be kind of an eccentric and very funny person, and very sane-minded but funny. But there's still a person there. So for this family member in particular, they believe that their mother is still there, but they clearly think that at some point she will become a vegetable. Again, in Lemos Decker's study of I think this is a study of anticipatory grief in caregivers. This person else in the study says, you don't have your mother anymore. So for example, things in my life I'd want to talk about with her, I can't. In that sense, she's completely gone. You're left with a fragment, a kind of mother, something that remains because she's still here. So again, you've got this sense of either being a vegetable or being gone or being not really here. But this quote in particular really kind of hints at this ambiguity of like they are still here, but in some respect they're gone. So I'd like to get onto that next. So that relates in particular to this phenomenon called ambiguous loss, which is a term coined by Pauline Boss, and it refers to the ambiguous experience of someone being both here and not here. So in the case of dementia, they might be physically present, but they're psychologically absent. And ambiguous loss typically causes boundary ambiguity, which she says is the painful experience of not knowing whether or not someone still fulfills a particular role in the structure of one's life. Now, that sounds very black and white and very instrumental, but it's not quite as simple as a black and white. Are they in or out of one's social circle? Are they in or out of fulfilling a role? There are, of course, more subtle and intricate ways that someone is kind of enveloped in one's life world. And it could be the case that certain possibilities that you connect with that person are, it's unclear whether they're gone, and then others, it might be a little bit less uncertain. So some things you might still be able to do with the person with dementia, and some things it might be less clear. So an example to make that a little bit clearer of the confusion and distress and uncertainty that boundary ambiguity causes, I have another quote from Dupuy's study. So this person is either a daughter or a son, and they say, I walked out of here and I cried and I thought, oh man, that's not my mum. That's just not my mum. But then next time you come in to visit, she's happy and bubbly and she still doesn't know who you are, but I can take her outside and give her a cigarette. She's happy. So this quote I chose really because it really gets across the confusion and the ambiguity involved. So they're saying in a couple of sentences, that's not my mum. But then in the very next sentence, they're saying, well, she's happy, she's bubbly, and she, I still can take her outside and have a cigarette. So in that ways, there is that still element of being the same person that she was before. So how can you kind of consolidate these two things? How can they be gone, but also still here in other ways? So I think that's an important question that I hope to answer in this talk. So yes, and another part of the ambiguity really comes across here. So this is also from Dupuy's study, and these two quotes are actually talking about the same person with dementia. They are two sons of a person with dementia. So I've called them brother one and brother two. So the first brother says about their father, my father is no longer alive. I can do whatever needs to be done for this shell, but that is not my father. My father died several years ago. So of course they don't mean literally, they mean in a sort of ambiguous loss kind of way where the physical body is still present, but in some respect they're gone. But then you've got this second son, brother two, who says, no, there are still characteristics, there are facial expressions, you can tell there is frustration at times, there are parts of his personality. He is also wanting to have hugs, he's wanting to hold somebody's hand, he's wanting for that tenderness. That is also part of my father. So no, he is still my father and he will be until the day he dies. And yes, he has this horrible disease, but that doesn't take away the fact that he is my father. So I feel very strongly about that. So I picked out these two because obviously they're talking about the same person. So this really gets across the confusion, because how can they be gone according to one person, but the other person referring to the same person with dementia, that they are still here and they're still seeing different sort of manifestations of their selfhood, in that they want to have hugs, they want to hold hands. And through these small gestures, they believe that their father is still present. So I think in these small gestures, we can find sort of small manifestations of selfhood. So how do we reconcile that? And I hope that will become clear. So what I'd like to also point out, of course, with those past quotes is obviously there's to that second brother, there is that appearance of being still here. And it seems to be the case that whether or not a caregiver viewed their loved one as gone or dead or a shell or a vegetable was often based on how the person with dementia was able to express a sense of selfhood, specifically in relation to the person the caregiver considered them to be, i.e., the image they had of them. So, for instance, the quote a couple of minutes ago, where the person says about, their mother still wanting to go outside and have a cigarette, or the father wanting to have hugs, hold hands. Maybe those things are highly relevant to the relationship they had with them. And so whether or not a family member might see a person with dementia as remaining themselves depends on their kind of perception of who they are. So another example of that is you've got this person called Patrick in a study by Lemos Decker, again on anticipatory grieving caregivers. And Patrick's mother, for her, having a glass of wine, he considered to be a huge part of who she was. She'd always drunk wine. And so every time he went to visit her in the care home, he'd always bring a bottle of wine for them to share. And it's something that he could kind of engage her with when she was otherwise unwilling to engage or unable to engage. So to Patrick, his mother no longer wanting or being able to engage in such an activity, this sharing of the wine, would be seen to him as a sign of her disappearing. So he linked the wine he brought on his visit specifically to his mother's person. If she drank the wine, she was still here. So that again homes in on the point that I was really trying to make. According to the family member, if they're able to do the specific thing that the caregiver or family member considers important, then they are seen as being still there. Similarly, the hugs, the facial expressions, the wanting to hold hands, all of those things could be seen as varying in importance depending on how the caregiver or family member sees them. So this kind of brings us to this idea of the bestowing of selfhood upon people. So, you are a self if I see you as displaying certain characteristics that I associate with your selfhood. That's the point. So this relates to Kitwood's idea, and he defines personhood as a standing or status that is bestowed upon one human being by others in the context of relationship and social being. It implies recognition, respect, and trust. But of course, in the case of the two brothers, if selfhood is something that has to be bestowed on people, then what does it mean when there are disagreement about whether or not selfhood should be bestowed, right? Because you've got the first brother who definitely isn't bestowing selfhood upon their father, and you've got the second brother who definitely does bestow selfhood. So obviously that's going to cause a little bit of confusion there. Which one do we go with? Like, how can we say whether or not selfhood remains if there isn't an agreement between people? It also kind of means that maybe caregivers' experiences of boundary ambiguity or ambiguous loss shouldn't be construed in terms of the metaphysics of self at all, but in terms of significantly altered interpersonal relationships. So maybe the reason why the two brothers disagree is because there's been such an alteration of the relationship what they have with their father. So maybe the second brother is able to maintain more of a relationship with the father than the first one is. And maybe that is what's making the difference here. Maybe it's not about metaphysics of selfhood at all and whether an actual self does remain, but it's just about altered relationships. But as Kontos points out, conceptualizing selfhood as essentially the human being in relation to others, as Kitwood has said, is to miss something vital about personhood, namely the existential expressiveness of the body in its relation to the world and our socio-cultural ways of being in the world. So essentially this bestowing or this more sort of social constructionist form of selfhood seems to be missing something. It's missing the fact that we are embodied and there are certain other characteristics related to selfhood that we might want to consider relevant. As Bryden points out in her autobiography, she says, "I'm not simply a bundle of attributes or a certain personality. There's much more to my life, my relationships, and my sense of unity, which is shaping my personal identity. I'm far more than a deteriorating self in an increasingly empty shell of a body with disappearing neurons and neuronal pathways." So what Bryden said at the end there really relates to this sort of Cartesian idea of what it means to be a self, where you've got this kind of like mind or self within this vessel of a body or a vehicle. And Bryden says, my fears after diagnosis were exacerbated by the very common dualist view of what I thought it meant to be a self, a person with a mortal brain/body and an immortal spirit. So this very idea of the body kind of carrying a mind that slowly disintegrates actually worsened fears after diagnosis. So it's not difficult to see how the view that the body is akin to an empty vessel with a person inside it escalates to talk of people with dementia being empty shells with the person gone. You've also got this Lockean view, of course, that personhood depends on psychological continuity, but that could also be very problematic for people with dementia who aren't able to retain any psychological continuity, or at least not a sufficient amount of psychological continuity due to their problems with episodic memory. So before I go any further, I want to establish that people with dementia very much do feel that they are still here from the testimonies that I've read. I've just picked out a few, but I could have added more and more. The reason why I didn't was because they're all kind of saying the same thing. So I'll just read out the ones that I've got. So we've got Bryden again. This is from an essay she wrote. She's very passionate about the fact that she very much does remain the same person that she was before she got ill. So she says, why a lack of a remembered timeline is so important to outsiders who then regard me as having lost myself. My narrative results from finding meaning in life and developing a sense of identity in the present moment, not based on events in the past. So for her, even though she has problems with episodic memory, she can find a sense of self right here in the present. She doesn't need to connect it to events in the past to feel like she is her. Similarly, Mitchell in her autobiography says, I've easily outlasted all predictions made for my prognosis and indeed any loss of self. I still feel very much me. I often say I'm still here. Bushnell this is a quote taken from the Outsiders Association website, and I believe he has a rarer form of dementia. I think it was like some kind of atrophy. I'll have to look it up. Posterior cortical atrophy or something like that. But he says, I'm still me. The most important thing to do is not give up. There's life after diagnosis. And Lee in her autobiography says, I've accepted I'll never be the way I once was, but I'm still a person. And Swather in her autobiography says, we're just changing in ways the rest of you aren't. We have increasing disabilities, and the sooner it's looked at that way instead of the stigmas, misunderstandings, and complete lies, the better for all of us living with dementia. And I put this quote in bold just because I feel like it's such a good quote, because it gets at the heart of what's really going on here. So it's not necessarily going to be that they are losing their sense of health self, but more that the self is changing in light of the disabilities and problems that they have associated with having this degenerative illness. But then we have to ask, well, what kind of self remains? There's a strong feeling that a self remains, but what is it? Well, it's really difficult to pick out just one theory because a lot of them seem to be relevant. And Strawson famously illustrated the problem. There's been an array of similar and very vague theories that have been suggested over several decades. So I'll just read out a few of them. So the cognitive self, the conceptual self, the contextualized self. I won't read out all of them, but there are a heck of a lot of them. And how do we possibly choose? So I'm at the beginning of writing a chapter. I think, well, I want to say selfhood remains in people with dementia. If I pick out a theory and say, oh, it remains in this way, this seems kind of arbitrary because there are a lot of different theories that could be relevant here. And a lot of them, selfhood could remain in all of those different ways. So, and also just saying that this kind of selfhood remains, but this other kind of selfhood doesn't remain, there doesn't seem to be much point to that because it doesn't really capture the lived experience of what they're going through. So just to pick out a couple of different theories that do seem to be quite relevant here. Obviously, we've got these embodied views that go back to Merleau-Ponty, but one I think that's been done very well is by Thomas Fuchs, who says that body memory and pre-reflective self-awareness can outlast reflective awareness and explicit memory. So that is a way in which a sort of embodied self could remain through these through body memory and habits that are deeply ingrained that could come out. So I have got an example right here. I was going to open it up, but when I tried it yesterday, I had some problems getting it working, so I might just describe it. And I'm guessing a lot of people might have heard of this example anyway. So we've got this example of someone with dementia who is 92 years old. And when asked if she can still play Beethoven on the piano, she initially says no. But then she's put in front of the piano, and because she played piano for all those years, it's deeply ingrained into her body memory. And she is able to take to the piano as if she only played it yesterday. And she does it a couple of times in the video, and it's very, very brilliant. Similarly, you've got this example of the Swan Lake, the ballerina that I'm sure everyone's probably heard of. But you've got this ballerina who obviously has dementia, and she used to perform Swan Lake through ballet moves all those years ago, and she can still take to it when she hears the music as if she's still a ballerina. So those seem to be ways in which selfhood can remain sort of deeply ingrained within. But another theory I'd just like to kind of highlight is obviously narrative theories. The theory that a narrative self can remain. So here's Mink writes about what he calls evocative objects that show that a meaningful narrative identity can still be constructed, even if only in the present moment. So the evocative objects, they relate to sort of meaningful objects in the environment that can trigger memories that would have otherwise been inaccessible. And through these memories, they can help to construct a narrative identity. So an item of clothing, for instance, that they used to wear, they can help put together what he calls the building blocks that put together a narrative identity. So, for instance, we've got another example from Wendy Mitchell in her autobiography. She has what she calls a memory room. So in recognition that her memory was getting worse, she took lots of pictures of her daughters and she put them all up in this memory room so that whenever she could go in there, the memories would, the pictures would trigger memories of when she took all those trips with her daughters. You've also got another quote from Bryden here, who says, "My condition is indeed deteriorating, but I can explore my experience in the present moment and reflect on my unfolding narrative to discover a continuing sense of self within my changing experience of and interactions with the world." So again, she's basically saying that episodic memory, oh, whoopsie, I didn't mean to skip forward. Episodic memory doesn't seem to be necessary for her to have a continuing sense of a narrative self, because she can put it together in the moment to figure out who she is and feel that she is a narrative self. It's also worth pointing out that narrative self does seem to be important to people with dementia, because take the example from the film Still Alice, where you've got a character who writes a list of questions about her life, and she makes sure that she can still answer these questions about her life as she goes forward. And she made a little kind of plan with herself that as soon as she wasn't able to answer those questions, she would actually choose to end her life. So that just shows kind of how important it is to remember certain facts about your life and the narrative that you have that led you to that point. But of course, lots and lots of theories seem to be relevant, and I've only named a couple. As Hughes and Beatty say, what it is to be a person, personhood cannot be circumscribed. That is, it cannot be narrowed down to one or other facet of our human lives. We're complex biological, psychological, social, and spiritual creatures. Yeah. So I want to propose that the most parsimonious way that we can accommodate all these elements is to say that they are all potentially relevant components of a self pattern. Now, I'll say a little bit more in a moment about what a self pattern is, but just to be clear, just to clarify two things, something before we get out of the way. You could ask the question of, are they still a person or self? And you could ask the question of, are they still the same person? So for the first question, I want to say that plausibly, even people in late stages of dementia can retain a self pattern. But for the second question, I want to say that, yes, they are indeed the same self. And even if the self pattern changes, they are still the same self. And even if they appear to be a different self, it's just, it just reflects a substantial alteration of the self pattern. So here we are, pattern theory. This is Sean Gallagher's theory, and I'll just try and describe this as clearly as I can. But Gallagher says the self is not a single thing, but is a dynamic pattern of interacting processes. These processes come from different dimensions, such as bodily, experiential, affective, social, and narrative aspects of human life. But there's lots of different aspects that make up the pattern, right? So the self we can think of as a complex evolving pattern made up of multiple interrelated factors rather than a fixed entity. And this framework helps explain how our sense of self changes across contexts and over time while maintaining coherence. So you can have certain changes in the pattern and yet still be the same self. We all change over the course of our lives, and the pattern probably changes all the time depending on various different things that you're going through in your life. So importantly, there's no organizing agent at the center of this self pattern. And to be honest, if there was, we'd then kind of be back to square one, because then we'd have to ask what this agent is. What kind of self is it? Like what self is it that does the organizing? So no, there's no agent at the center of the self pattern, but Gallagher argues that we should think of the person as the systemic whole enacted in the processes and dynamical connections of the self pattern. So rather than there being an agent at the center of it, the self emerges from this pattern. So it's a pluralist account in that the pattern is made up of a variety of factors and processes. The self emerges from the organization and interaction of these multiple components. So there are no necessary or sufficient conditions for a bunch of factors or processes being a self pattern. Different combinations of factors and processes can count as a self pattern, can be jointly sufficient. And we can think of the pattern as what he calls a dynamical gestalt, because the factors and process involved are dynamically interrelated. Adjustments in one aspect above a certain threshold will lead via dynamical interactions to changes in others. For example, very basic aspects of self-experience, such as the sense of agency, can be modulated by more complex relational aspects, such as social normative factors that involve culture, gender, race, health, and so forth, and by specific intersubjective factors that can either diminish or enhance one's autonomy and sense of agency. So essentially, because all the different parts of the pattern are sort of interlinked, if one factor is affected in some way, it may have a sort of impact on the other aspects of the pattern. That's all he's saying there. So one of the benefits of adopting a pattern theory of self is that it can accommodate a host of theories that seem to be relevant in people with dementia. And we can see how this could be when we consider that you've got all these different aspects of the pattern, such as bodily aspects, narrative aspects, as I previously mentioned. So you don't have to compete with these different theories and in terms of picking one that suits people with dementia. You can just accommodate them all within the pattern. So Gallagher's primary proposition is that psychiatric disorders are self-disorders. So, for example, in the case of major depressive disorder, all aspects of the self pattern may be affected due to changes in what Matthew Radcliffe calls existential feelings. So their entire world, their entire sense of being might be completely changed by having depression, and we can think of this as a self-disorder. And in terms of pattern theory, we can think of it as the pattern having changed in some way. Widespread changes to the self pattern could similarly be recognized in mental illnesses like schizophrenia. However, it's possible that although a loss of a sense of agency may be reported in people with this illness, other basic experiential elements may remain illuminated. So again, it's just kind of saying the same thing as with depression, where you may have changes to the self pattern in light of a psychiatric disorder, and some aspects of it might change, while some don't. But see, these changes don't mean that they're no longer persons. So, I mean, the point that I ultimately want to make is that if we say that the self pattern changes in people with dementia, then analogously, why should we say they're no longer persons? The outward manifestation of the self pattern is idiosyncratic and could depend on the scaffolding available at the time. So which aspects of the self pattern change might depend on how they are scaffolded. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. So to make it clear in my own head, when I was writing this, I wanted to make a little bit of an analogy. So I wanted to compare it to a light up dance floor, when we don't really see those anymore in 2025. But I say that if we think of it as this dance floor with all the squares kind of interlinked, we can think of each of these squares as some factor or process in the self pattern. And we can think of them as either lighting up or not lighting up. So certain scaffolding can trigger the lighting up of a square, but this might depend on the availability of that scaffolding. So if there's certain outward manifestations of their selfhood that means something to a caregiver or a loved one, it might have to do with the relational aspects and the interpersonal relationship. So the presence of the caregiver, or the example of Patrick in Lemos Decker's study, bringing that bottle of wine for his mother, might cause that square to be lit up and for his mother to still be here. So looking again at something like major depressive disorder, it can be the case that the overwhelming disruption to existential feelings that people with the illness describe could be remedied with certain medications. So it's also worth noting that biological factors could be relevant in how the self pattern manifests. However, biological factors don't really tell the full story. There seems to be a lot more going on. So Sabat and Collins found that in their studies demonstrating, they found that there are studies that demonstrate the complex and multifaceted ways that cognitive capabilities are scaffolded. For example, A.R. Luria, in his remarkable case studies of brain-injured people, concluded that a person's mental faculties are not entirely dependent upon one's biology, but also are influenced significantly by one's experiences and culture. Thus, he proposed that it's important to study a person's cognitive functions not as independent entities, but rather in the context of the person's living and formative influences. So one way we could explain this is Hughes and Beattie say that we are situated in a context, and so will always be, and this will always be relevant to how the self pattern is scaffolded. So situated in terms of our history, our personal narrative, we can never quite, it's always inextricable from our experience of the world, the fact that we are situated in a particular context. You could also say that evocative objects are relevant again here for Heersmink, and you could say that body memory for Fuchs is also relevant again here. So going back to boundary ambiguity for a minute for caregivers and family members, from their perspective, when it's uncertain if the person they knew is gone, certain characteristics that are recognizable to them as being associated with the person they knew can sometimes be brought out if certain scaffolding is available. So we can think of the evocative objects as a sort of scaffolding. So you've got the meaningful items of clothes, you've got music, for instance, and upon interacting with these things, memories are evoked that otherwise wouldn't have been. So we can think of that as scaffolding those memories and allowing there to be a narrative self, which is what Heersmink says. So I'd like to apply this now to paradoxical lucidity. So paradoxical lucidity is an episode of unexpected, spontaneous, meaningful, and relevant communication or connectedness in a patient who is assumed to have permanently lost the capacity for coherent verbal or behavioral interaction due to a progressive and pathophysiologic dementing process. Now, it can be distinguished from terminal lucidity, and terminal lucidity refers to essentially the same thing, but it happens in the sort of last few days of the person with dementia's life. I'm going to keep calling it paradoxical lucidity because I don't see that there's a reason to call it terminal lucidity instead, because we can just say that paradoxical lucidity occurring in the last few days of their life still is paradoxical lucidity. It's still paradoxical in that it's unexpected to occur based on, the kind of symptoms or scans that have been done. They shouldn't be expressing themselves in certain ways according to the science, and yet they do. So Peterson and colleagues say all instances of terminal lucidity are paradoxical, but not all instances of paradoxical lucidity are also instances of terminal lucidity. So in practice, when it comes to family members, loved ones, caregivers, it's generally thought of as the person with dementia unexpectedly coming back or returning. So I've got a particular study here that I'd like to refer to, in which caregivers and family members of people with dementia were interviewed about their experiences of paradoxical lucidity. So this person, caregiver 7, describes it as, it seems like someone is disease-free and they're back to their same normal self and they just remember everything. They just are, for some reason, like a light bulb goes off and they're back. So again, like conveniently for my chapter, I guess, they say it's like a light bulb goes off, which you can make this analogy with the dance floor that I've proposed in the self pattern. So it's one of these squares on the dance floor coming back on, I say, because of some kind of relevant scaffolding that was available that was able to trigger that light bulb and bring them back. Similarly, caregiver 2 says, and sometimes I often wonder, like, if her soul is like out of her body. And then every once in a while, something will happen and she pops back in. So you've got light bulbs coming back on, you've got them popping back in. It's this idea of them coming back after seemingly being gone. Similarly, this person says, because usually when the lucidity happens, it's already when they're so far in the fog that they, you know, they're not really there with you most of the time. And so I feel like maybe it's just them reaching out to say, hi, I'm still in here, you know, which again, this idea of them being still in there, that really kind of corroborates what I found in the autobiographies of people with dementia themselves, where they're very, very vocal about the fact that they do believe that they are still here and that they will remain here. So again, going back to those 2 brothers in Dupuis' study, it says the lighting up of the pattern may be influenced by the perceptions of others and the scaffolding they offer. So the assumption that they're gone, shells or zombies, may be harmful, not only in the ways previously mentioned. It might also mean that if they're thinking of them as being gone or being shells or being zombies, then they basically are gone. So if they can potentially provide the scaffolding to supposedly bring them back, although of course I'm going to argue that this paradoxical, you can kind of deflate the paradox because they were never really gone if we understand the self pattern to remain. So similarly, you've got this example in Lemos-Decker's study, The Bottle of Wine scaffolded Patrick's mother's ability to engage in a meaningful interaction. Marta, who was still able to perform ballet moves to Swan Lake. This idea of paradoxical lucidity was caused only by the fact that the relevant scaffolding, i.e. the music that was so familiar to her, lit up that square on the dance floor. You've also got this other quote from Gilmore by Kosky that says, she did not communicate anything verbally, but hearing her mum's voice, her eyes opened really wide a couple of times and she was like frantically tapping her hand. And I kept telling my grandma, she has something to say to you because she's just like tap, 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 tapping. Although she didn't regain the ability to communicate in that moment verbally, the available scaffolding was sufficient to trigger some process in the self pattern, which allowed the person with dementia to express themselves in a certain way through the tapping. And this in itself was sufficient for the caregiver's belief that the person with dementia had returned or come back for a moment and was trying to communicate something via this tapping. So whether or not you think they had come back, the fact that caregivers and family members describe it as them coming back, they seem to think that this expression of the tapping or anything like that is enough to say that they are back. So if the relevant scaffolding is needed to activate some factor or process in the self pattern, it could be that instances of paradoxical lucidity are merely cases in which some square that hasn't been lit up for a long time is lit up again, rather than the person coming back. So we can just think of it as a changed self pattern. Then certain squares were perhaps lying dormant. You know, it was still a capacity, or you know, they had the potential to come back if the relevant scaffolding was available. If this is the case, then people in late stages of dementia are no more gone than anyone else who needs certain scaffolding to be able to be available in order for certain factors or processes in the self pattern to be activated. Just like the person with major depressive disorder might need certain medications to activate biological processes that are able to bring out this outward manifestation of selfhood. You could say the same for people with dementia, only you could say that their scaffolding was something like a familiar piece of music or a certain social interaction. And this was enough to make a certain square on the dance floor light up and give the appearance of them coming back. But of course, if we think of it as a changed self pattern, then they were never gone in the first place. It was just that the self pattern had changed so much that certain squares or factors or processes, whatever you want to call them, were just not triggered for a while. So ultimately, I'm going to bring it towards an end with this quote again from Swaffer in her autobiography. She says, "Even though we may be changing, we're always still all there. A person dying from terminal cancer or motor neuron disease is all there, and so are people with dementia. We change each and every day and after every significant experience, and it's not different for people with dementia." So, of course, there may be cases where it's unclear whether or not a self pattern remains. But if we think of the self pattern as a capacity, i.e. that certain squares might be illuminated or have the potential to be illuminated if the relevant scaffolding is available, it's plausible, it's at least plausible to say that even people in late stages of dementia do retain a self pattern and are not non-persons. Thank you.